And so, I mean, we're talking kind of late 90s. This is the early days, certainly of laser sintering compared to where it is now. I mean, that had to be one of the first kind of pushes to actually make some of that equipment production ready, right? Like even now you see some machines that are still mostly prototyping, but like how hard was it to get a system that early on to a point where it's qualified and you had the materials locked in, your process controls locked in, and working with the manufacturer to do all that?
Great question, and it was a real challenge. And again, I'll just kind of give you all your audience a fun story that at Boeing at the time, we started off with low rate initial production with internal using the internal facilities to build these parts, and then the company also set up and spun out a couple companies to do this. One happened to be on-demand manufacturing in Camarillo, California. Um, but one of the things that we noticed that we had a certain type of laser sintering machine locked in the version software that you were running. We had the materials spec, and with everything kind of well bounded on the process and on the materials, we saw all kinds of variability. Uh, uh, and one of the fun examples that I still remember to date is our facility, the facility in Canoga Park, California. I think it had about a dozen machines in it, and the folks that were running that operation named all of those people, all the machines, people's names. Like, well, Joe's doing fine, and Mary's having a fit, and and Jason, well, he's kind of on the line, and so we definitely saw significant process variability from machine to machine back in those days because it was really more of a prototyping technology and not that repeatability that you need from build to build that typical manufacturing technologies give you. And how we worked around that in order to adopt and use the technologies, we basically put travelers into the build things. And so they had to meet a certain mechanical property and had a whole process there. As long as that they met those mechanical properties, then the build was considered to be a go or good. And if it didn't, then it was a failed build or no go.
And that probably had to be that whole project is one of the first real examples of putting production parts onto aircraft, right? I mean, this that whole process of going through the qualification that's timely, it's expensive, and really like I mean, a lot of the same work that you had to go through back then 20 years ago, you still have to do today, right?
Yeah, and absolutely. And there was other learnings that we kind of fell into. It wasn't by design. It's just like, oh, when we went to set up the initial supply chain to do these parts, because this was for a production aircraft program. These were for flying parts. Then we had to go make the decision: do we make or buy, or do both? And so when we go to buy, it's just like, who do you go to buy laser centered parts from? Well, there was a number of companies out there that had multiple machines and were subject matter experts in the technology. Um, Great prototypers, but they had to learn their way as far as becoming production. And one of the things you can do with a powder bed system is that you could pause it, and if you had room in it, you could drop another part on top of it in order to maximize your output on the machine, which is pretty common for most people in the services business. Well, you change the heat load and potentially change the whole mechanical properties for your parts. And so we had to amend the specs to say, hey, this is going to be the build layout. It's frozen. You cannot add or change anything, and you can't move it around to the front or the back or left or right. That it's frozen. And if you do need to do something, you have to consult with the company to get approval before proceeding forward with it. And so those are the types of things that we had to kind of overcome in the early days because we would see the changes in those travelers. That was basically the go no go criteria on the builds.